Turn my mic on so you can all hear me breathing really heavily after that. That was a mashup of two tunes. First was Miles Davis's Blue and Green, followed by my own tune off my upcoming album. The tune is entitled Cicely. Do you guys remember what it was like being a little kid and getting to explore all of the things you could do when you grew up? I do. And the fascinating thing about how we play as kids is we don't practice doing something. We practice being someone. If you wanted to be an astronaut, you were blowing off bottle rockets in your backyard. Ground control. This is Neil Armstrong. You were Neil Armstrong. Or if you wanted to be a scientist, you were hiding in your parents' master bathroom, mixing everything you could find under the sink until your mom found you and yelled at you. Mom, I'm Mary Curie. I wanted to be a jazz musician when I grew up. So I was sitting in my church band, riffing along to common gospel songs, pretending I was Charlie Parker, the father of bebop and one of the most studied jazz soloists of all time. And what we're doing when we're little kids, and we're pretending to be someone instead of just doing something, is engaging with legacy, that thread that connects mentor to student, hero to future world shaker. Legacies are important to us, because by looking at what the people who came before us did, we find our own path forward. Mary Curie took the science world from here to here, so I'm going to start where she ended and go here. Legacies are important because they teach us how to find our own direction. And the jazz world has historically called our legacy the jazz men, and there's many men to choose from. Herbie Hancock, Chick Corea, Sonny Stitt, Max Roach. And they're not just musicians, right? They're also fashion icons, social commentators, civil rights activists. They're artists. What a legacy to join. But what about jazz women? Who do little girls get to look up to? Who don't just do what they want to do, but identify the way they identify. We have a few women in jazz who are musicians, not nearly as many as men, but a few. But the way our current education system is designed, we hear very little about those musician women. And most of the women we hear about were the wives and the girlfriends, or the survivors of sex trafficking and abuse that the books like to call pimp girls. And when you're a little girl and you're reading these books and you're reading about your heroes and this long list of women that they hurt, it's hard to forget about them. You see, I wanted to grow up to be Charlie Parker, and when that stopped being childlike play and started being study, I read his biography. I wanted to learn how he invented bebop. And I did. But I also learned about a lot of his problematic relationships with the women in his life. Just one example, he used to pay his agent to keep women stocked in his hotel rooms and taxis. I was 15 when I read this, and I am a woman. Of course, I identified with and felt for those women who he hurt, because that was the culture at the time. So to keep playing jazz, there was only one way to do it, and that was to separate Charlie Parker into two people in my mind. The legacy of one of the greatest musicians to ever live, and the legacy of American misogynistic culture from the 20th century that I wanted to destroy. But whether I was engaging in that legacy or not, that legacy was still being carried out. When I was 17, I joined one of the best big bands in my region on tenor 2. This is an alto saxophone. So a little bit bigger, a little bit less scary of a part to play. And my lead alto player looked at me and said, "You know, if I didn't have a girlfriend, I'd take you to my truck after rehearsal." I'll let you imagine all the gruesome things he said after that. And I thought, okay, Charlie Parker, maybe not the best role model. Maybe too many people read his book and think that's a good thing. But clearly, all jazz musicians aren't like that. Clearly, it was just Charlie Parker and not a systemic issue that all of our books talk about, right? I read the Miles Davis autobiography next and learned about how he had one of the most prolific 60-year careers of any jazz musician. And I read that interspersed with sentences of, "I had to beat her, or else she would have left me for some man in LA," or "I had a stable of bitches waiting up for me in New York." It turns out that this wasn't Charlie Parker, but the echoes of a culture where that was normal. And because jazz education is only 60 years old, all of our books still talk about it like it was a good thing. And whether we like it or not, because these are our heroes, they influence the way we act around it. My first year of college, I was playing a recital, and our drummer came in the very day of the concert. He was a substitute because our normal drummer got sick. And he heard me play during our sound check. I was wearing this super cute orange skirt. And he looked me in the legs and said, "Well, we'll have a big audience, but no one's coming to listen." See, because we idolize these people so much and we don't adequately talk about how to really critically think about legacies and which parts of them are worth keeping and which aren't, people start to act that way just because it's their hero and they want to emulate them. I thought this was just a me issue. Maybe I was the only person who had a problem with this. Maybe I'm the only person who feels angry, who feels scared that she's going to end up a survivor of something rather than a musician. It turns out this affects most women in jazz. A study conducted by Dr. Sarah Rain found that in the jazz community, 90% of women feel that they experience gender discrimination. 30% of those are willing to speak about a specific incident of sexual harassment. But right now I'm talking about jazz education and not the professional world, so let's talk about education. If you pick up an instrument sometime before college and you're a boy, you have a 62% chance of continuing to play when you graduate high school. If you're a girl, that chance drops to 26%. And that's because our education system creates this environment where we feel like we need to emulate people from a completely different culture, of a different time, even though we know better today. I was in a dinner with Andia Owens, a MSU alum and a famous bassist, with a bunch of other girls from the music department, and a music education major burst into tears in the middle of our dinner and said all I ever wanted to do was become a famous jazz tenor and clarinet player. But the boys threatened me every day, and they told me to stay in my place, so I did. Now she's pursuing a music education degree, which isn't what she wanted, but I have faith that as a music educator, she'll help change the narrative. And the interesting thing about the narrative is it's not totally accurate, and I discovered this while I was reading Miles Davis's autobiography. Now, although he says a lot of misogynistic things, which were normal during that time, he also makes several interesting comments, like, "I got by with the help of women. If it weren't for the women who supported me, I don't know how I would have made it in the industry." One of the biggest voices in jazz said this, and as soon as he said it, I knew there was a part of the story I was missing, that I hadn't been taught yet. But let's back up. Why is Miles Davis important? If you're a jazz musician, you already know. But if you're not familiar with him, you have him to thank for almost all of your favorite music, specifically indie rock, hyperpop, psychedelic rock, funk, R&B, fusion. Pretty much if there's an instrument in it, he influenced it. He recorded over 100 albums during his lifetime, and he's responsible for inventing 2 genres of music. So when somebody like him says women were necessary to his success, you know they played an important role and they have an important legacy. So I started researching every woman I could find who had a relationship with Miles Davis. And what I found out was that being a survivor of a misogynistic culture is the least interesting thing about them. Let's talk about Jean Moreau. Most people in the jazz world don't know her name. She was just another one of Miles Davis's flings when he was traveling across the world. She's actually part of the reason we have Kind of Blue. And Kind of Blue, remember I mentioned Miles Davis invented 2 genres? This is the first of them. Before Kind of Blue, most of the music you listened to was tonal, meaning certain harmonies could only happen at certain times. Once we had modal music instead of tonal music, slower harmonies, with less emphasis on you have to play these notes. And in Miles's words, it gave him pure melodic freedom. This changed the way we wrote music. And he experimented for the first time with Jean Moreau. See, when he was in France in the 50s, he was hired to write the soundtrack for the film Elevator to the Gallows, a crime noir Jean Moreau was starring in, where most of her scenes were completely silent. She was wandering through the streets of Paris, looking for her missing detective husband. And Miles found these scenes so inspiring that rather than write music for the film, he brought his band into the studio with a TV screen and watched Jean Moreau's scenes play out on the screen and read her acting like it was sheet music. She was the music. And he recreates this later with Kind of Blue. He went in with descriptions of what he wanted for the songs and some small scribbles of what he wanted, but no composition. It's thanks to his collaboration with Jean Moreau that we have that. But maybe Jean Moreau is a one-off story, so let's talk about the woman who gave him that film scoring job. This is Juliette Greco. The jazz world knows her as the love of Miles Davis's life, but her story's way crazier than that. She was studying to be a dancer in Paris when World War II broke out, and her family was sent to a concentration camp after she punched a Nazi in the face. When the war ended, she became a singer, actor, and model, and she was the face of the French alternative left bank movement. She was good friends with Jean-Paul Sartre, who wrote the lyrics for most of her songs, and also friends with Pablo Picasso, and she introduced Miles to both of them. And her anti-authoritarian attitudes heavily influenced the way Miles Davis thought about race, both in America and in the rest of the world. It's thanks to Juliette Greco that we have Miles Davis's attitude on Black Power and his famous smolder. That's all the work of Juliette Greco. Now, after Miles Davis came back to America, he married Frances Taylor. And most people in the jazz world know her as, one of my bassist friends said, that bombshell on the cover of ESP. Which this is actually very important, and it's a huge thing that she did. Because before marrying Frances Taylor, Miles Davis's record labels would put white women on his covers to try to sell to white audiences. Miles and Frances said, nope, that's Eurocentric. This isn't representative of the music we're making. So Miles wrote into his contracts that only Black women could be on the covers of his albums to showcase Black beauty and Black power, which is why we have so much of Frances Taylor on his work. But being a model is not the most important thing she did. Frances Taylor was actually the first Black person to dance in the Paris Opera Ballet. She was also the #1 dancer on the opening cast of Broadway's West Side Story. Now, 3 shows into the run, she married Miles Davis, and he forced her to stop working. And she never really got back into performing after she divorced him, instead focusing her attention on the next generation, opening up a studio in New York to educate the next dancers. 9 years later, Miles Davis married Betty Mabry, a model and singer who had just come to New York. At this point, Kind of Blue is a decade old, and you can't financially survive making jazz records. It's all rock and Jimi Hendrix. But it just so happens that Betty Mabry is one of the queens of funk, and she's personal friends with Jimi Hendrix. So she introduces Miles Davis to him. She starts bringing him to funk and R&B shows. She inspires him with her sense of Afrofuturistic style. And 1 year later, he records Bitches Brew, which is the invention of fusion jazz. Fusion jazz combines the genius of Jimi Hendrix, the edginess of rock and roll, and the creativity of jazz. It's called one of the Picassos of records, and it was his second best-selling album after Kind of Blue. All of the funk and R&B we listen to today is influenced by Bitches Brew. Betty Mabry herself was a huge person in the funk movement and in the women's rights movement of the 60s, although most of her music wasn't allowed to be played on the radio because it was too sexual. Is anybody a WAP fan here? Megan Thee Stallion and Cardi B? Yeah, Betty Mabry did that like 50 years before either of them did. This is a face you might recognize. Cicely Tyson has been one of the biggest faces in American film history. She's won countless BAFTAs, Grammys, Oscars, NAACP Image Awards. She was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Barack Obama. You might know her from her work in Sounder or the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman. Now, she influenced Miles directly, both in her amazing work in film, but also because she helped him kick his heroin habit twice. Like Frances Taylor, when she got older, she decided to focus her attention on the next generation, giving master classes and workshops to younger kids who were aspiring to be actors. She has a memoir called Just As I Am, and one of my favorite things about her is that in her last interview, somebody asked her, "Cicely, what's the greatest thing you've ever done?" She said, "I've done my best. That's all." So what do all these stories teach us about the legacy of women in jazz? It teaches us that our legacy isn't just the few women musicians we have recordings to look back on, but also survivors of a misogynistic culture, civil rights activists, women's rights activists, philosophers, artistic collaborators, singers, actors, models. What a strong legacy. What amazing directions to take from these women. After learning about them, I realized I didn't need to be afraid of not becoming a musician and being reduced to a survivor, because no one's just that. Everyone has an amazing story that contributes to the legacy. Now, this concept isn't new, trying to rewrite history so that it's more accurate. You've probably seen it done if you've seen the movie Hidden Figures or read the book The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. And you can do this too, if you have a space where you feel like you're lost or you don't have a legacy, or you're a little mistreated. Maybe you're the first person of color in your particle lab. Maybe you're the first manager at your company who signs off emails with they, them pronouns. Maybe you're just a student who feels a little confused because none of your TAs or professors speak the way you do. You can solve this issue and find your legacy by doing the same thing that jazz musicians do when they try to learn to emulate their heroes. See, if I want to learn to play the way Charlie Parker or Miles Davis did, what I do is I listen to a song that one of them soloed on. We call it transcribing, but you listen really closely. You master not just the notes they played, but the dynamics, how they tongue each note, what's loud, what's soft, what's gentle, what's harsh. You master that, and you don't stop there. Next, you listen to the bassist. How are they playing the quarter notes with a sense of time that defines how the soloist plays their sense of time? Now you listen to the drummer. What are they throwing at the soloist back and forth? What ideas are they repeating? What new ideas are they offering? And then the pianist. What extra harmonies are they implying that the musician can bounce off of to play something completely new and never heard before? You see, you can't understand what your heroes did until you understand all of the voices that were influencing them, the collective musical picture. And we can do the exact same thing with history. When we feel lost, when we feel like we only have a couple voices to listen to and someone's voice is missing, listen closely, research, dig into spaces you might not have before. You'll discover there are voices influencing the prominent ones that you can build a legacy off of and find your own path forward.